Why was she the only one awake when the first explosion tore through the base? Hazel Carter's eyes snapped open to a whistle she almost mistook for the ringing in her ears after long hours at the computer lab. But the sound grew into a roar, a tearing scream from the night sky, and then impact. The ground shook, the walls trembled, and the forward operating base she had called home for 6 quiet months was suddenly alive with fire and chaos. She rolled out of her bunk, heart pounding, mind still thick with sleep. The emergency lights flickered red, washing the narrow civilian quarters in a bloody glow. Dust filtered from the ceiling tiles. Another explosion. Then another. The ground itself seemed to lurch as though the earth had turned against them. Hazel's first instinct was denial. Maybe it was just harassment fire, the kind that had rattled the base before but never truly threatened it. A mortar here, a rocket there. But then came the alarm, harsh, mechanical, inhuman. A voice followed, sharp and cutting through the crackle of the intercom. All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. We are under attack. Her breath caught. Hazel grabbed for her vest and helmet. Contractors were required to keep them by their beds, though most of the civilians treated them like burdens, never expecting to use them. The straps felt clumsy in her hands as she fastened them, her fingers trembling. Somewhere beyond the thin walls of her quarters she could hear shouting, the sound of boots slapping against concrete, rifle bolts being pulled, and beneath it all the deep stuttering of machine guns. She was supposed to run to the bunker. She knew the rules. Civilians stayed out of the way. Civilians survived by keeping their heads down while the Marines did the fighting. But something about the tone of the explosions outside told her this wasn't routine. Hazel paused in the hallway, glancing through a reinforced window. The sight rooted her where she stood. The wire perimeter was glowing, shredded apart by carefully placed blasts. Flames licked upward where fuel stores had ignited. Beyond the wire, through smoke and shadows, muzzle flashes winked like fireflies. Not 3, not 5, dozens. A force big enough to overwhelm a forward base that was supposed to be safe. A force that had planned this. The base was bleeding, and she was standing in the middle of it. She forced her feet to move, joining the stream of civilians pushing toward the designated bunker. When she reached it, the small concrete box was already bursting with people, clerks, cooks, mechanics, men and women who, like her, had come for contracts and paychecks, not firefights. They pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space, voices rising in panic. What's happening out there? Mortars. No, it sounds worse than that. Hazel caught sight of Jack Morrison, the grizzled senior contractor who always seemed to know more than he said. His face was grim, jaw set like stone. Coordinated, he muttered. They've been planning this. The words sent a chill through her chest. The bunker shook violently as another impact struck somewhere close. Screams rose in the dim light. Through the thick walls, the civilians could hear the stutter of rifles, not random shots, sustained, relentless, the sound of a perimeter collapsing. Minutes stretched into eternity. Hazel's palms were slick with sweat as she gripped her helmet straps. Then the door burst open. A Marine corporal stumbled inside, his uniform torn, his face streaked with blood. His voice cracked with urgency. "We need to move. The enemy breached the wire there inside the base." The words turned the bunker into chaos. Fear surged like wildfire. Morrison shouted over it, trying to keep order. "Stay together. We'll head for the command bunker. Move now, stay low, follow me." Hazel's legs carried her with the group as they poured into the night. The air outside hit her like a wall, acrid smoke, cordite, burning fuel. Flames rose from the motor pool. Shadows of men darted between buildings, some Marines, some not. Gunfire raked the ground, sparking off metal. 30 unarmed civilians moving across open ground. It was madness. Hazel felt her lungs seize with each step, waiting for the inevitable. It came sooner than she thought. Figures appeared from the shadows, 8 of them, rifles up, AKs flashing. The night erupted in death. Bullets tore into the ground around the contractors, whizzing overhead with a sound she would never forget. People screamed, some falling, some frozen in place. Hazel hit the ground hard, her cheeks scraping concrete. For an instant she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was going to die here like this, just another civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then she saw him. 10 meters away, slumped behind an overturned vehicle, lay a Marine. He couldn't have been older than 19. His eyes stared blankly at the stars. Beside him, an M4 rifle, its matte black surface catching the firelight. 3 spare magazines lay scattered near his lifeless hand. Hazel's chest tightened. She felt the world shift around her. The enemy was advancing, closing in on the civilians like wolves circling sheep. In seconds, they'd finish it. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She scrambled across the ground, bullets cracking overhead, and dove behind the vehicle. Her hands trembled as she reached for the rifle. It felt heavier than she remembered, heavier than the hunting rifles of her childhood in Texas, yet strangely familiar. The selector switch was set to semi-auto. She flicked it to full. She could almost hear her father's voice in the back of her mind. Steady hands, control your breathing, don't hesitate. The enemy was 20 meters away now, laughing among themselves, rifles loose in their hands. They weren't expecting resistance, not from a bunch of contractors, not from her. Hazel rose. The M4 kicked hard against her shoulder as she unleashed a burst. The lead fighter stumbled back, collapsing before he even realized what hit him. Hazel shifted, fired again. Another man dropped. The remaining 6 dove for cover, shouting, suddenly aware they weren't hunting sheep after all. "Holy shit," Morrison's voice broke through the chaos. "Carter, what are you doing?" Her reply came sharp, louder than she thought possible. "Staying alive. Get them to the command bunker, I'll cover." She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She slammed a fresh magazine into the rifle, her fingers surprisingly steady. Fire. Move. Fire. Move. She wasn't thinking about numbers or odds. She wasn't thinking about what she was supposed to be. She was only thinking about the civilians still scrambling toward safety. Every instinct screamed to run, but something deeper, something older held her in place. She remembered being a girl on her family ranch, holding her breath as a deer appeared in her sights. She remembered the stillness, the focus, the weight of the choice. Except tonight wasn't about deer. Tonight was about people. A fighter rounded the shipping container. Hazel squeezed the trigger, 3 rounds precise, center mass. He dropped instantly. Another tried to flank her. She shifted position, firing 5 rounds before he could even lift his rifle. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The rest scattered, no longer confident hunters. Hazel pressed forward, advancing instead of retreating, driving them back with each burst. She barely registered the shock in Morrison's voice or the panic of civilians behind her. The world had narrowed to the rifle in her hands, the muzzle flashes in the dark, and the pounding of her own heartbeat. And in that chaos, in that impossible moment, something inside her shifted. She was no longer the invisible IT contractor everyone dismissed. She was no longer the civilian told to hide while others fought. She was simply fighting. Fighting for her life, fighting for theirs. Her rifle grew hot, smoke curled from the barrel. She reloaded again and again, her mind quiet in the storm. Each shot landed, each movement was deliberate, and for the first time in her life she felt what it was to stand on the line. But beneath the adrenaline, beneath the surge of survival, Hazel felt something else. Fear. Not the kind that froze you, but the kind that sharpened you, that reminded you what was at stake. Every civilian still running, every Marine already fallen, every heartbeat she could still protect. And maybe that was the moment, the exact breath in time, when Hazel Carter stopped being a bystander and became something else. She stood alone behind the smoking wreckage, the M4 warm against her palms, the night still echoing with the last crack of her gunfire. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was heavier, tighter, like the breath the world holds before another blow. Why hadn't the enemy rushed her yet? Why were they pulling back when she was just one woman, barely trained, barely holding it together? Hazel's answer came in the form of voices, marine voices, cutting through the gun smoke. "Carter, on your six." She spun. From the shadows emerged four figures in combat gear, rifles leveled, moving with the precision of professionals. A sergeant in his 30s, stocky, scar across his cheek, nodded to her as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Staff Sergeant Torres," he barked, giving his name almost out of reflex. His eyes scanned the field, the bodies around her, the still smoking barrel of her rifle, the civilians huddled farther off. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Hazel's breath came ragged, but her voice held steady, keeping them alive. Torres blinked. For a moment the chaos around them seemed to pause. He studied her stance, her eyes, the absolute refusal to step back. Then finally he gave a sharp nod. "Fine, you're with us, but you follow orders, no heroics." She could have laughed at the absurdity. Heroics. She was barely keeping her hands from shaking, but she just said understood. Together they pushed toward the eastern perimeter. The sound there was relentless, explosions, bursts of rifle fire, the guttural shouts of men advancing. Hazel had never heard a battlefield before tonight. It wasn't just noise. It was alive, a storm that swallowed everything else. Torres signaled his squad down behind a thick concrete barrier. 50 hostiles, maybe more. They've breached 3 gaps in the wire, he reported over his radio. His jaw tightened. They're moving toward the command bunker. Hazel crouched beside them, peering into the darkness. Enemy fighters were darting between cover, organized in small squads, pressing forward with determination. Her stomach tightened. She knew enough to recognize they weren't amateurs. The Marines began firing, and Hazel did the same. Through the iron sights the world shrank again, down to shapes and movement, to the pull of the trigger, the crack of the rifle. She found her rhythm: breathe, aim, squeeze. A fighter with an RPG collapsed before he could raise it. Another went down trying to drag a wounded comrade. Hazel's shots were precise, deliberate, not frantic. "Nice shooting," muttered one of the Marines beside her. "Better than half the squad." She didn't answer. She couldn't. She wasn't ready to acknowledge what that meant. The enemy fire grew heavier, peppering the barrier, chipping concrete into their faces. Hazel felt the sting across her cheek but ignored it. Torres glanced at her. "You burning through ammo." Hazel checked her mags, 2 left, her chest tightened. "I'll make them count." One of the younger Marines, barely older than the boy she'd taken the rifle from, tossed her 2 of his own. "You're keeping us alive out here. Take 'em." Hazel's throat tightened at the gesture. She nodded once, too overcome to speak. The minutes dragged into an hour, then more. Wave after wave tried to break their line. Every time the defenders, 4 Marines and 1 stubborn contractor, pushed them back. Hazel's body ached, her shoulder bruised raw from the recoil, her ears ringing. Still she fired. Still she held. But the truth pressed harder with each spent magazine. They couldn't hold forever. "We're low across the board," Torres said at last, his voice reluctant. "We'll have to fall back to the command bunker, make a final stand." Hazel shook her head. The movement came before the words. "No." Torres turned on her. "What?" "We don't fall back," Hazel said, voice low but firm. "Not this time." "Ma'am, with respect, you're not trained for this." "I just dropped 6 fighters out there while covering 30 civilians," she snapped, cutting him off. "You really think I can't handle this?" The Marine stared at her. Even Torres had no answer. Hazel leaned forward, her green eyes blazing with a conviction she hadn't known she carried until this moment. "They think we're cornered. They expect us to hunker down and wait. What if we do? What if we make them run?" Silence hung heavy. One Marine whispered, "That's insane." "Maybe," Hazel admitted. Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with something sharper. But they don't know how many of us are left. They don't know we're outnumbered 10-1, and they're scattered all over the base. If we hit them fast, hit them where they don't expect it, we can cut them apart. It was madness. Every part of her logical mind screamed that. But another part, the part that remembered nights hunting deer on the ranch, the patience of tracking, the rush of choosing the exact moment to strike, that part knew she was right. Tors studied her for a long time. The firelight flickered across his scar. Finally, he spoke. "You ever done anything like this before?" "No," Hazel said honestly. "But I know one thing: you don't wait for prey to find you. You go after it." Tors exhaled long and slow. Then he nodded once. "All right, we hunt, but we do it smart. Stick together, hit fast, disappear before they regroup. And Carter," his voice hardened, "tonight you're not a contractor, you're a Marine." The words hit her like a weight. She wasn't sure she wanted them, but she didn't have time to think about it. They moved out like ghosts in the dark. The base that had been her quiet workplace only hours ago was unrecognizable now. Shattered walls, burning vehicles, bodies where there had once been laughter. Hazel moved with the squad, every sense sharpened, the rifle now an extension of her body. They struck fast. A squad of hostiles regrouping near the mess hall never saw them coming. Hazel picked off two with controlled bursts before the Marines cut down the rest. They vanished into the smoke, moving toward the motor pool. Another group, 5 men reloading in the open. Hazel signaled before she even thought about it, her hand rising instinctively. They fanned out, opened fire, dropped them all in seconds. Again and again they struck, then disappeared, then struck again. The enemy had come prepared for a siege, not for hunters. Confusion spread in their ranks. What had begun as overwhelming numbers now looked vulnerable, fractured, panicked. Hazel's heart pounded, but her movements felt eerily calm. The lessons of the night wrote themselves into her bones. Don't stay still, don't hesitate, trust your instincts. Each time she fired, a shape fell. Each time she advanced, the enemy stumbled. By the time the sky began to pale, the base had shifted. What had been 50 attackers storming in the night was now a dwindling handful, scattered and afraid. Tors, radio crackled. Reinforcements inbound, 15 minutes out. Hazel was down to her last magazine. She checked it twice. 30 rounds, 30 chances. And then came the final rush. 6 fighters, desperate, charging the command bunker in a last bid to finish their mission. Hazel's breath slowed. The world shrank again. She fired controlled bursts. 2 dropped, 3, 4. Her last magazine spat fire, precise, unrelenting. The 6th fighter collapsed yards from the bunker door. Silence. The only sounds now were the crackle of fire, the moans of the wounded, the heavy breathing of Marines who had survived the night. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ, Carter, how many?" Hazel's mind flicked back through the storm of the night. Her throat went dry. 17, confirmed. Tor stared at her like he was seeing something not quite human. 17. You killed 17 men. Hazel shook her head, gripping the rifle tighter. We did. It was teamwork. But Tors didn't agree. His voice was quiet, reverent, almost afraid. No, I've seen Marines fight their hearts out, but I've never seen this. You're something else, Carter. She looked down at her rifle, smoke still curling from the barrel. For a moment, the weight of what she'd done pressed down hard. The faces of the men she'd killed, the civilians she'd saved, the line she had crossed forever. She wasn't sure if she was proud. She wasn't sure if she was broken. She only knew one thing: she would never be the same again. And the night wasn't over. Why was it so quiet now? Hazel Carter stood among the broken walls and burning wreckage, her rifle lowered, the barrel still faintly smoking. The silence after 6 hours of chaos was deafening, heavier than the thunder of gunfire. She could hear her own breathing again. She could hear the faint crackle of flames. She could even hear the shifting groans of the wounded. The base had survived, somehow. but Hazel wasn't sure she had. Her body trembled, not from cold, though the desert night was bitter, but from something deeper. The recoil of the rifle still pulsed through her arms, her shoulder raw where the buttstock had hammered her over and over. Her lips were cracked, dry from breathing smoke and dust. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the weapon. And then came the smell. Not just burning fuel and shattered buildings, but the other smell, the one she couldn't force her mind to process. Blood, metal, flesh torn by high-velocity rounds. 17, she had said it aloud. 17 men, maybe more, dead because of her. She wanted to believe it was a victory, that she'd saved lives, that she'd done what had to be done. But the faces of those men, glimpsed in strobing muzzle flashes, falling beneath her fire, flashed through her mind like ghosts. She had never imagined herself capable of it. Not like this. Carter. The voice jolted her. She turned to see Torres approaching, his helmet dented, his gear streaked with dirt and ash. The sergeant studied her in the dim light. His men were already moving among the wounded, pulling comrades to safety, checking magazines, reloading for the next fight. Hazel just stood there, frozen in the weight of what she had become. "You did good," Torres said quietly. She shook her head, swallowing hard. "I killed them." "You saved 30 civilians," he countered. "You held a line that would have collapsed without you. Don't get lost in numbers, Carter. Look around. These people are alive because you stood your ground." But his words didn't erase the images burned into her. Nothing could. Before she could answer, the distant thump of helicopters rolled over the horizon. Searchlights cut through the smoke. The deep, steady chop of rotor blades grew louder, a sound that brought relief and sorrow all at once. Reinforcements. The Marines cheered weakly, some too exhausted to lift their rifles, but their eyes turned upward in gratitude. Hazel watched the helicopters descend like metal angels into a courtyard littered with wreckage. Marines in full combat gear poured out, weapons ready, sweeping through the base with disciplined precision. Within minutes the battle was truly over. The attackers were gone. The base was secure. Hazel lowered herself to a piece of broken wall, her legs finally giving out. She set the rifle across her lap. Her green eyes, red-rimmed and burning, watched the new arrivals move with the confidence of men and women who hadn't just lived through hell. Was she one of them now, or still something else? She didn't know. "Carter," Torres called again. This time his tone was different, formal. She looked up to see a tall officer approaching, his uniform marked with rank. Colonel Harrison, the base commander. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice measured. "I've read the preliminary reports. They make for interesting reading." Hazel blinked up at him, too tired to rise, too heavy with doubt to offer excuses. She just held the rifle across her lap, the weapon that had changed her life in one night. 17 confirmed, Harrison continued. Civilian evacuation under fire, tactical support of a Marine fire team. Not bad for someone whose job description is, what, network administrator. Hazel's lips parted, the words scraped out. "I just did what I had to do, sir." The colonel studied her a long moment. Then slowly, he sat on the rubble beside her. The base commander, sitting in the dirt beside a contractor still wearing blood on her boots. "You could have stayed in the bunker," Harrison said. "No one would have blamed you. You could have let Marines handle it. That's what the rules said. But you didn't." Hazel looked down at her hands, at the dirt caked into her skin, at the rifle that no longer felt borrowed. "This base, these people, they're my home, my family. When someone attacks your home, you don't hide, you fight." For a moment the colonel didn't answer. His gaze was heavy, like he was weighing her in silence. Then he nodded slowly. "You discovered something about yourself tonight." Hazel exhaled. The truth of it burned in her chest. She had discovered something, but she wasn't sure she liked it. She wasn't sure she could live with it. "Ms. Carter," Harrison continued, his tone shifting, The Marine Corps is always looking for people who display qualities like yours: natural leadership, tactical instinct, courage. If you wanted, there could be opportunities. Hazel's eyes flicked up sharply. Opportunities. Officer candidate school, he said plainly. A commission. A chance to turn what you showed tonight into something lasting. The thought hit her like a second explosion. She almost laughed, the sound bitter in her throat. I'm a contractor. I fix servers and routers. I'm not. You're not a Marine, Harrison interrupted gently. Maybe not, but maybe you've always been one and just didn't know it. Hazel looked at the men and women around her, Marines hauling wounded, Marines regrouping, Marines standing guard. Could she be one of them? Did she want to? Her hands tightened on the rifle. She thought about the weight of it, the way it had felt both alien and natural, the way it had pulled something out of her she hadn't known was waiting. I'd have to start over, Hazel whispered. Learn protocols, prove myself all over again. Yes, Harrison said simply. You face skepticism, doubt, you be questioned, almost certainly. And if I fail? The colonel gave a small, rare smile. Then you fail, but I don't think you will. Hazel's chest rose and fell. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away, go home, forget the smell of blood and the sound of gunfire. But she also knew she couldn't. Something had changed inside her, something that wouldn't fit back into the life she'd lived before. Her lips curved into a faint, exhausted smile. Where do I sign? Harrison nodded once, as though he'd expected the answer all along. For the first time that night, Hazel Carter felt something like peace. Not relief, not pride, just a quiet recognition that she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. And somewhere deep inside her, in the silence after the storm, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of dying, not of fighting, not of becoming something more than what she'd been yesterday. Because fear was just a feeling, and tonight she had chosen not to let it decide for her. Why was everyone staring at her? Hazel Carter stood in formation among 40 candidates on the parade deck, the morning sun cutting sharp shadows across their ranks. Sweat gathered beneath her collar, but it wasn't the heat that made her skin burn. It was the weight of their eyes, curious, skeptical, sometimes hostile. She knew what they were thinking. She'd read it in their glances since the moment she arrived. She wasn't supposed to be here. She hadn't enlisted. She hadn't been shaped by years in uniform. She was the contractor, the woman who'd grabbed a rifle one night in Afghanistan and killed 17 enemy fighters. Some called her a hero, some called her a fluke. None of them called her a Marine, not yet. The drill instructor's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Candidate Carter, front and center. Hazel's boots thudded against the pavement as she stepped forward, every muscle taut. The instructor, a mountain of muscle and fury, leaned in until his brim nearly touched her forehead. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. You think one lucky night makes you one of us? Hazel kept her gaze forward. No, sir. You think the Corps needs civilians who get scared, grab a rifle, and stumble into glory? Her throat tightened, but her answer was steady. No, sir. Then what the hell are you doing here? The question struck like a blow. She thought of that night at Riverbend. The gunfire, the smoke, the civilians behind her, the fear she'd turned into fire. She thought of the colonel's words. Maybe you've always been one and just didn't know it. Hazel's voice was low but firm. I'm here to earn it, sir. The instructor stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a sharp pivot, he barked, back in rank. Hazel returned to her place. The eyes were still on her, but something had shifted. A test had been thrown and she hadn't broken. The days that followed stripped her down to the bone. Officer candidate school was relentless. Early mornings, endless runs, obstacle courses designed to break spirit as much as body. Classroom sessions on tactics, leadership, history. Evaluations of every movement, every decision. Hazel struggled. She wasn't the fastest. She wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the loudest, but she refused to quit. Every time she fell behind on a run, she forced her legs to keep moving. Every time she failed a drill, she stayed up late practicing until she could get it right. Every time doubt whispered that she didn't belong, she remembered the civilians huddled behind her that night, the Marines bleeding out beside her, the way fear had almost drowned her, until she'd chosen to rise. Her peers tested her in other ways. Some avoided her, convinced she'd been handed this opportunity without earning it. Others challenged her outright. One evening in the barracks, a candidate named Russell confronted her. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You're here because of a story, because some colonel wanted a headline. The rest of us, we bled for this." Hazel didn't argue, she didn't shout. She just looked him in the eye and said, "Then watch me bleed for it too." That night she ran extra miles alone on the track, sweat soaking her shirt, lungs burning. And she ran not to prove Russell wrong, but to prove herself right. The weeks stretched on. Hazel grew harder, leaner, sharper. She learned how to command a squad through field exercises, her voice growing steady even when her hands still trembled afterward. She learned how to write reports, how to make decisions under pressure, how to carry not just her weight but the weight of others. But the hardest moments weren't physical. They came in silence, in the quiet after lights out, when doubt crept back in. Could she truly lead Marines? Could she be more than the woman who got lucky once? Could she live with the faces of 17 men she would never forget? One night, after a brutal field exercise in the rain, she sat alone under the dripping canvas of her shelter, staring at her boots. A fellow candidate, Alvarez, sat down beside her. She had been one of the few who hadn't treated Hazel like an outsider. "You know what they say about you, right?" Alvarez asked softly. Hazel didn't answer. "They say you're dangerous. They say you'll break. They say you don't have what it takes." Hazel's throat tightened. She forced herself to ask, "What do you say?" Alvarez shrugged. "I say anyone who picked up a rifle when she didn't have to is already a leader. The rest, training, protocol, discipline, you'll learn. What you can't teach is heart." Hazel stared at her, the words sinking deeper than Alvarez knew. Heart. That was what had carried her that night. Not training, not experience, just heart. When graduation day finally came, Hazel stood in her dress blues, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her green eyes steady. The commandant himself pinned the gold bars of a second lieutenant onto her shoulders. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent formation, "you represent something vital to this corps. You remind us that Marines aren't born, they're made. Made in moments of crisis, when ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things." Hazel's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she belonged. As the ceremony ended, the commandant leaned in slightly. "You have a choice now. You can take a safe staff job, sit behind a desk, or," his eyes gleamed, "you can go back to the field, to where it all started." Hazel didn't hesitate. "Send me back." The commandant smiled faintly. "I thought you'd say that." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hazel stood alone, the bars still shining fresh on her shoulders. She thought of Riverbend, the smoke, the fire, the choice she'd made when she picked up that rifle. She had been a contractor, a civilian, a woman no one noticed, and now she was a Marine officer standing at the beginning of a road she couldn't yet see the end of. And she realized something. That night at Riverbend hadn't been an ending. It had only been the beginning. Why did they trust her? The question rattled inside Hazel Carter's chest as the armored convoy rumbled across the Afghan desert. She sat in the lead vehicle, helmet strapped tight, rifle across her lap, the desert sun hammering down through the armored glass. On her shoulder gleamed the gold bars of a second lieutenant, and in the vehicles behind her, 40 Marines, her platoon. Men and women who had trained, who had bled, who had enlisted years before Hazel ever touched a rifle. They called her ma'am now. They saluted her. They looked to her for orders. But in her chest, she felt the same weight she had felt that night at Riverbend, fear. Only this time it wasn't for herself. It was for them. She remembered the words of one of her instructors at OCS. Leadership isn't about being the bravest. It's about being the one willing to carry everyone else's fear. Her radio operator, Corporal Davis, leaned closer in the cramped vehicle. "Lieutenant, we're 10 clicks out. Intel says the village is quiet." Hazel nodded, though her gut told her quiet was rarely what it seemed here. The convoy rolled into the village, dust trailing behind them. Mud brick homes lined narrow streets. Children peeked out from doorways. Old men sat on stoops, eyes unreadable. Nothing seemed wrong, and yet Hazel couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond sight. She gave the order to dismount. Her Marines flowed out, securing positions, moving with trained precision. Hazel scanned the rooftops, the alleys, the shadows. Every detail pressed into her senses. The world had taught her once that danger didn't announce itself. It arrived in a rush of fire and chaos. Minutes passed, reports came in. Nothing unusual, but still her skin prickled. She stepped toward Davis. "Have the 3rd Squad sweep the west alley. Something doesn't feel right." He nodded, relaying the command. And then it came. The explosion ripped through the silence, shaking the ground beneath her boots. A plume of smoke and dust rose where the 3rd Squad had entered the alley. Screams and gunfire followed instantly. The village erupted. Figures poured from hidden doorways, rifles raised. Bullets cracked through the air. Hazel's body reacted before her mind caught up. "Contact! Return fire!" Her Marines responded instantly, forming firing lines, taking cover behind walls and vehicles. The village square became a battlefield. Civilians scattered in panic. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the deafening rattle of gunfire. Hazel dropped to her knee, rifle up, firing controlled bursts toward the alley. But her mind was split, half focused on her own shots, half on the chaos of command. She could hear the panic in voices over the radio, the fear of young Marines under fire for the first time. This was her test, not surviving leading. She forced her voice steady. "1st Squad flank left, suppress their fire. 2nd Squad hold the square. 3rd Squad status." Static, then a broken reply. 3 wounded, 1 KIA still taking fire. Hazel's chest constricted. The temptation to rush forward, to fight like she had that night as a lone contractor, almost consumed her. But she wasn't a lone fighter anymore. She was an officer. Their lives depended on her thinking, not just shooting. "Corpsmen to the alley," she ordered. "2nd Squad cover their advance." She moved along the line, shouting encouragement, pulling Marines back from panic. A lance corporal froze under fire, his rifle slack in his hands. Hazel grabbed his shoulder, her voice cutting through the roar. "Look at me, breathe. Sight picture, squeeze, you've got this." His eyes locked on hers. He steadied, raised his rifle and fired. The fight raged for what felt like hours but was only minutes. Hazel directed fire, called positions, shifted squads. Her radio barked constant updates. Slowly, painfully, her Marines pushed the enemy back. The alley was cleared, the square secured. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. The village was silent again. Hazel's chest heaved as she lowered her rifle. Around her, Marines checked weapons, dragged the wounded to safety, secured the dead. Dust still hung in the air. The smell of cordite and blood was thick. She forced herself to walk the square, to look into every face. Relief, exhaustion, fear. They looked to her, and she gave them nods, words, steadiness she didn't always feel inside. The corpsman approached. His face was grim. "Lieutenant, we lost Private Hensley." Hazel's stomach dropped. She knew the name. She knew his face, 18 years old, freckles, the youngest in her platoon. He had told her just yesterday he wanted to go to college after his enlistment. For a moment her vision blurred. The weight of it pressed down, the first Marine to die under her command. Davis's voice cut through softly. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" Hazel's throat ached, but she forced her voice to steady. "We hold position, secure the village, treat the wounded. We move out at 1700. The Marines dispersed, obeying without hesitation. Hazel remained standing in the square, staring at the spot where Hensley had fallen. She had survived Riverbend because she had nothing to lose. Tonight, she had everything to lose. The truth burned in her chest. Leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about carrying ghosts. That night, as the platoon rested in a secured compound, Davis sat beside her. The stars burned cold above them. "Lieutenant," he asked quietly, "were you scared out there?" Hazel stared at the sky, terrified, more scared than I've ever been. "Then why didn't you freeze?" She thought of Riverbend. She thought of the alley, the faces of her Marines, the weight of every choice. "Because fear is just a feeling," she said finally. "It doesn't get to make decisions, duty does." Davis nodded, his face illuminated by starlight. Hazel looked back at her platoon, sleeping in the dust, their trust in her stronger than any medal or report. And for the first time she felt the truth. She was no longer proving herself. She was leading. Even if it broke her. Why did they whisper her name when they thought she couldn't hear? Hazel Carter had grown used to the looks, the sidelong glances, the half-smiles, the quiet awe. Around campfires, in chow lines, in the silence before patrols, Marines spoke of her like she was more legend than lieutenant. The contractor who had fought like a Marine before she ever wore the uniform. The officer who never asked others to do what she wouldn't. The leader who stayed in the dirt with her platoon, shoulder to shoulder, instead of hiding behind rank. Hazel didn't want to be a story. She just wanted to be steady enough to keep them alive. But stories had a way of growing in war zones. Weeks blurred into months, patrols across valleys and ridges, through villages where loyalty shifted with the wind. Long nights on overwatch, her platoon scattered across hillsides with only the stars for witness. Each mission carried risk. Each mission tested her. And every loss weighed heavier. Hensley's name stayed with her. She carried it like a stone in her chest. At night, when the desert went still, she heard his laugh. She saw the freckles across his face. And though she told her Marines that courage was acting despite fear, Hazel sometimes wondered if courage also meant carrying the unbearable, the ghosts who never left. But her Marines trusted her. That mattered more than the whispers. They followed her without hesitation. One evening, after a long patrol, Corporal Davis broke the silence as they cleaned their rifles under a sliver of moonlight. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful, "the men talk. They say you've got instincts." Hazel looked up. "Instincts? Like you know where trouble's coming from before it hits, like you can smell it in the air." Hazel almost laughed. She didn't feel gifted. She felt haunted. But she remembered Riverbend, remembered that same tightening in her gut that had saved her life and theirs. "Instincts are just paying attention," she said softly. "War teaches you to listen to the silence. It's never quiet without reason." Davis nodded, filing the words away like scripture. The next test came sooner than anyone expected. Orders arrived from battalion. Hazel's platoon would spearhead an operation into the Koresh Valley, a stretch of rugged terrain known for ambushes and supply caches. Intelligence suggested a large enemy force was operating there, moving weapons through mountain passes. It was dangerous. Some called it reckless, but Hazel didn't argue. She saluted, took the briefing, and returned to her platoon. That night she gathered them in the dim glow of lanterns. Faces lined with fatigue stared back at her. Some eager, some anxious, some quietly resigned to whatever waited in the dark. Hazel spoke plainly. "Tomorrow we go into Koresh. Intel says enemy movement is heavy. That means contact is likely, maybe more than we've seen before. I won't lie to you, it's risky. But if we succeed, we cut off their supply lines and protect every base in this sector. If we fail, she let the silence finish the thought. She looked around at them, seeing more than Marines. She saw sons and daughters. She saw the weight of families back home, names on dog tags that meant more than numbers. "I won't ask you to do anything I won't do myself," Hazel said. Her voice was steady now, but her heart pounded. "Stay sharp, trust each other. Fear will be there. Let it, but don't let it decide, we decide." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the platoon. Later, as they prepped gear, Alvarez, her closest ally since OCS, sat beside her. "You talk like someone who's already been through hell," Alvarez said. Hazel's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Because I have." Alvarez hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever wonder why it's you? Why you keep walking out of it when others do?" Hazel's chest tightened. She thought of Riverbend. She thought of Hensley. She thought of 17 faces she could never erase. "Every day," Hazel admitted, "and the answer never comes." Alvarez was quiet for a moment, then offered, "Maybe the answer is why. Maybe it's what you do with it." The words lingered with Hazel long into the night. When dawn broke, the platoon moved out. The Koresh Valley stretched before them, harsh ridges, jagged rocks, shadows deep enough to swallow whole squads. Hazel's instincts screamed at every turn. Each bend in the road felt like a trigger waiting to be pulled. Hours passed. The silence of the valley pressed in. Birds didn't stir. No voices, no distant movement, too quiet. Her gut twisted. "Hold," she ordered softly over comms. Her Marines froze, rifles raised. Hazel scanned the ridgeline. Something about the stillness was wrong. Then it broke. Gunfire erupted from above, cascading down in a hail of rounds. The ridgeline lit up with muzzle flashes. Rockets streaked toward their convoy, detonating in thunderous bursts. "Ambush," Hazel's voice ripped through the comms. "Take cover, return fire." The valley became chaos. Bullets tore through dust. Marines scrambled behind boulders, returning fire upward. Explosions shook the ground. The enemy had them pinned, elevated with superior numbers. Hazel's pulse thundered, but her mind cut sharp. First squad suppress the ridge left. Second squad maneuver right, find a flank. Davis, get comms to battalion. Tell them we're in contact. Her Marines obeyed instantly, trusting her voice even in the storm. Hazel crawled forward, sighting targets, firing controlled bursts. Each shot cracked through the dust and smoke, each movement calculated. But this was Riverbend. This wasn't an attack they could turn into a hunt. This was a trap set for them. Minutes stretched, casualties mounted. A machine gun on the ridge chewed through their cover, pinning half her platoon. Hazel's jaw clenched. If they stayed, they'd be cut apart. She keyed her mic. "Tors, where's second squad?" Moving up the ridge, heavy resistance. Hazel's breath quickened. The machine gun kept shredding their line. Her options narrowed. She could wait for air support if it came in time, or she could risk everything on a maneuver. The choice twisted inside her. Orders said hold. Logic said wait, but her instincts screamed move. She took a breath, then gave the order. "Third squad with me. We're taking that gun." There was a pause, then voices answered in unison. "Aye, ma'am." Hazel rose from cover, rifle ready, leading a half-dozen Marines into the teeth of fire. Bullets cracked around them, dirt exploding at their feet. Hazel moved with grim determination, sprinting low, firing as she went, her squad following her lead. They reached a cluster of rocks near the base of the ridge. The machine gun thundered above, still pinning their platoon. Hazel's lungs burned, her hands steady on the rifle. She turned to her squad. "We climb, we end it." No one argued. They began the ascent, clinging to rocks, hearts hammering, the roar of the gun above them. Hazel moved first, pulling herself upward, her boots slipping on loose stone. Every muscle screamed, every instinct told her to stop, but she kept going. Halfway up, a figure appeared above, rifle aimed down. Hazel didn't think. She raised her M4, fired a burst, and the man toppled backward. They pushed on. When they reached the crest, the machine gun roared just yards away. Two fighters manned it, firing into the valley below. Hazel didn't wait. She surged forward, firing point blank. Her squad joined her, grenades and rifles tearing the position apart. The gun fell silent. The valley echoed with sudden stillness. Her platoon below erupted in renewed fire, seizing the opening. The tide shifted. Enemy fighters began to falter, retreating back through the ridges. Hazel stood on the crest, chest heaving, rifle hot in her hands. Her Marines gathered around her, eyes wide with something beyond relief, respect. Davis's voice crackled over comms. "Lieutenant, you saved us." Hazel stared out over the valley, her heart pounding with something darker than triumph. Saved them, yes, but at what cost? How many names would she carry from this day? How many ghosts would follow her home tonight? The valley wind cut sharp across her face, and Hazel whispered words no one heard but herself. "This is who I am now, a leader, a fighter, a survivor, and maybe a sinner too." Why couldn't she sleep anymore? Hazel Carter lay on her cot in the dim glow of the forward base barracks, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Outside, the Afghan night was still, but inside her mind the echoes of gunfire roared without mercy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them: the ridge in Koresh, the flash of muzzle fire, the bodies falling one after another. She should have been exhausted. Days of patrols, ambushes, briefings, nights of fractured rest. But her body refused the peace of sleep, and when it came, it betrayed her with dreams. Dreams of Riverbend, dreams of Hensley, dreams of the men in shadows she had gunned down to save her Marines. Dreams where the line between enemy and ghost blurred until she woke, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like she was still under fire. She sat up, pressing her palms into her face. The barracks were quiet, her platoon scattered across bunks, their breathing deep, untroubled. She envied them. She envied their ability to lay burdens down, if only for a few hours. But she was the officer, the one they trusted, the one who couldn't falter. That truth was heavier than any rifle. The days moved forward, one bleeding into the next. Hazel performed her duties with precision: patrol briefs, tactical reports, coordinating supply runs, walking lines with her squads. Outwardly, she was calm, steady, unshakable, the officer they needed. But in the quiet moments, cracks spread. She caught herself staring too long at empty bunks. She avoided writing letters to families, postponing them until guilt forced her hand. She carried a notebook in her pocket where she scribbled names of the fallen, each one etched like a scar across paper she could barely bring herself to read. The platoon noticed. One evening, as she checked weapons before a patrol, Alvarez stepped close. "Ma'am," she said softly, "you haven't slept. You can't carry this weight alone." Hazel forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Alvarez, just thinking." "You're not fine," Alvarez replied. "You don't eat, you don't sleep. You think we don't see it, but we do." Hazel's jaw tightened. She wanted to admit it, wanted to let the weight spill into someone else's hands, but the words stuck. She shook her head. "They need me steady. If I break, they break." Alvarez didn't argue further, but her eyes lingered with quiet worry. The next mission blurred into another. A patrol through farmland riddled with hidden explosives. A skirmish at dusk, sudden and sharp. A night raid where silence was broken by a single shot that nearly cost a corporal his life. Each moment added another stone to Hazel's chest. One evening, sitting outside the command tent, Colonel Harrison, now a brigadier general, found her staring at the horizon. His presence was steady, the same man who had first told her she might belong in uniform. "You carry yourself differently," Harrison observed. Hazel gave a hollow laugh. "That's what happens when you carry ghosts." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "You've been losing sleep." Hazel said nothing. He sighed, his voice softer now. "Carter, every leader faces this. The weight never gets lighter, you just get stronger, but if you pretend it doesn't hurt, it will crush you. Hazel finally turned, her green eyes hard. If I let them see me doubt, if I let them see me crack, they lose faith, and then they die. I won't let that happen. Harrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There's strength in silence, but don't confuse silence with solitude. Even wolves hunt in packs. Hazel looked away, swallowing the words she couldn't speak. That night she sat alone at her desk, pen hovering over another letter to another family. She wrote the words carefully, the official phrases. Your son served with honor, his sacrifice will not be forgotten. But she paused halfway, her hand shaking. She wanted to write the truth, that she remembered the freckles on his face, that he had been afraid but brave, that she saw his last breath and carried it still. Instead, she folded the paper and sealed it, the truth locked inside her chest where no one else could see. Weeks passed. The platoon's respect for her grew into something like reverence. They followed her without hesitation, whispered her name in the dark like a talisman. But Hazel began to feel the distance growing too. They saw her as unbreakable, and unbreakable things are not touched, not comforted. One night, Davis asked the question no one else dared. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "do you ever wish you stayed a contractor?" Hazel's breath caught. She thought of her old life, fixing servers, updating networks, invisible in the corner of every room. A life where no one died because of her decisions. A life without ghosts. And yet when she answered, her voice was steady. No, because when the moment came, hiding wasn't an option. And once you learn that about yourself, you can't go back. Davis nodded slowly. Then I'm glad you're here. The words struck her deeper than he knew. But that night, as sleep finally claimed her, the dream returned. Riverbend. The first Marine's body, cold beneath her hands. The weight of the M4 she had pulled from his side. The first man she killed, his eyes wide in shock before he fell. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright, drenched in sweat. Her hands trembled. For a long moment she pressed her palms to her face, fighting the urge to scream. In the silence, her whispered confession filled the barracks, heard only by herself. I'm so tired of being brave. Why was the night so quiet? Hazel Carter crouched with her platoon along a ridge overlooking a remote valley. The stars hung sharp above, cold pinpricks in a black sky. The radio hissed softly in her ear, but no voices came. Just silence. It wasn't right. Quiet in Afghanistan rarely meant safety. Quiet was the mask before a storm. Her Marines shifted uneasily around her. Alvarez scanned through night vision goggles. Davis double-checked the comms. 40 Marines waiting for a sound, a signal, a reason. Hazel's pulse was steady now. She had learned the rhythm of fear. It still came, always, but no longer ruled her. She carried it like she carried her rifle, heavy, necessary, part of her. Tonight's mission was simple on paper. Intercept an enemy weapons convoy moving through the valley, prevent resupply to hostile forces. But Hazel knew simplicity never survived contact with reality. She whispered into her mic, eyes sharp, this isn't over yet. Minutes dragged. The air felt heavy, thick with expectation. And then faint at first came the sound, engines, multiple, growing louder. Hazel raised her hand. Her platoon froze, rifles ready. Headlights cut through the dark, 3 trucks moving slow, flanked by armed fighters. Her gut twisted. Something was off, too open, too careless. A convoy this exposed wasn't sloppy, it was bait. Her instincts screamed. Hold fire, she ordered softly. The Marines stiffened. Every instinct begged them to engage, but they trusted her. The trucks rolled into the valley floor, and then the trap snapped shut. Gunfire erupted from the ridges opposite them, tracers slicing the night. Rockets streaked down toward Hazel's position. The trucks below swerved, enemy fighters pouring from the beds, returning fire. Ambush, Davis shouted. The night exploded into chaos. Bullets ripped into stone around them, sparks flying. Hazel dropped flat, returning fire downrange. Her Marines spread, finding cover, answering with controlled bursts. Her mind worked faster than her hands. They were outnumbered, pinned between ridges. The kill box was closing. For a heartbeat, the memory of Riverbend slammed into her, trapped civilians, overwhelming fire, the certainty of death. She had chosen then. She would choose now. She keyed her mic, her voice steady. First squad, suppress left ridge. Second, flank right with me. Third, hold position and cover. Her Marines moved instantly, trust carrying them even through fire. Hazel led second squad down the ridge, sprinting low, bullets tearing the ground at their heels. The air was thick with dust and heat, each breath raw in her throat. They reached a cluster of rocks halfway down. Hazel fired, 3 quick bursts, dropping 2 fighters on the ridge below. Her Marines followed suit, their fire coordinated, disciplined. Still the enemy pressed. More figures spilled from the trucks, more muzzle flashes split the dark. Hazel's platoon fought fiercely, but the odds were brutal. Davis's voice crackled in her ear. "Lieutenant, they're pressing both flanks, we'll be overrun." Hazel's lungs burned, her mind cutting sharp. She saw the whole battlefield like a map in her head. The trucks, the ridges, her squads locked in a desperate fight. If they stayed pinned, they'd die here. There was only one option. She grabbed Davis's arm. "Call it in. Danger close fire mission. Artillery on the convoy's coordinates." His eyes widened. "Ma'am, that's right on top of us." "I know," she cut in. "Do it now." Davis hesitated for half a second, then relayed the call. Hazel turned to her Marines, her voice fierce. "Brace for impact. We hold here." The minutes between call and strike felt endless. The enemy pressed harder, sensing desperation. Hazel fired until her rifle clicked empty, reloaded, kept firing. Her shoulder throbbed, her throat raw from shouting. She saw Alvarez drag a wounded private behind cover, blood slick across her hands. She saw fear in the eyes of her Marines, but not panic. They were steady, because she was steady. And then the sky fell. Artillery screamed down from miles away, slamming into the valley with earth-shattering force. Fire and dust erupted, swallowing trucks, fighters, and everything caught too close. The ground shook like the end of the world. Hazel hit the dirt, her helmet rattling against stone. Heat washed over her. The roar deafened her. For an instant she wondered if she had killed them all, enemy and Marines alike. Then silence. She lifted her head, ears ringing. The valley was unrecognizable, smoke, fire, shattered earth. The trucks were gone, twisted wreckage smoldering. Enemy fire had fallen silent. What fighters survived were fleeing into the night. Her Marines stirred around her, coughing, groaning, alive. Hazel rose slowly, her rifle hanging heavy. Her chest heaved as she looked across the wreckage. They had survived, barely. Davis staggered to her side, dirt streaked across his face. "Lieutenant, that was insane." Hazel managed a faint, exhausted smile. "Sometimes survival is insane." The platoon regrouped, tending wounds, reloading weapons, scanning the horizon for threats. The ambush had failed. The convoy was destroyed. They had held. But as Hazel stood amid the smoke and ruin, her gaze lingered on the valley floor. The wreckage of men who had once been alive, now scattered shadows in the firelight. Her chest tightened. She had saved her Marines, she had done her duty, but the ghosts would follow, they always did. Hours later, back at base, reports were filed, casualties were counted. Her platoon spoke of her with reverence, voices hushed, awe in their eyes. To them she had done the impossible again. To Hazel she had simply chosen to act, chosen to risk everything, chosen not to let fear decide. That night, sitting alone outside her tent, Hazel watched the stars burn cold above the desert. She thought of Riverbend, of Hensley, of every name in the notebook she carried, now 1 page heavier. She realized something then. She had never sought this, not the medals, not the whispers, not the legend they built around her. She had only ever wanted to do what was necessary, to keep people alive when no one else could. And maybe that was what being a Marine really meant. Not the title, not the uniform, but the willingness to stand up when standing was hardest. Hazel closed her eyes, letting the silence of the desert settle into her bones. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.